Okay, let's take a look at the last mistake they made. Well, not really a mistake. I just think they didn't explain it well enough or say as much as they should have about the next item. So let's take a look at that.
The RIAA is an equalization scheme that is applied to the sound before the master lacquer is cut. In essence, this curve reduces bass content and boosts treble in the record. The preamp applies the inverse of the RIAA curve, perfectly restoring the music's natural balance and minimizing the size constraints that are intrinsically linked to the nature of the media. In essence, this means that the sound wave becomes compressed, forcing the quieter parts of the song to become relatively louder and the louder parts relatively quieter.
So we have two problems to solve here relating to vinyl records. One is you're dragging a needle across a piece of plastic, for crying out loud. That's noisy. So we have to deal with that noise of that needle being dragged across the plastic. Well, that noise tends to be high-frequency noise. It's a high-pitched scratching noise, not a low-pitched rumbling noise. And so what we can do is simply use a low-pass filter which allows lower frequencies to come through fully and attenuates the higher frequencies. That's what they are explaining with the RIAA curve, if that's a good representation of it. What this means is, if I just draw some lines around this graph, at lower frequencies, here's our frequency, low frequencies, high frequencies, what they do is they run through a low-pass filter to bring down the high frequencies to reduce the noise. But of course what that does is it takes away your high frequencies of your music, and so your music sounds like it's on the other side of a wall. So what they do is when they master the record, they increase the loudness of the high frequencies. So low frequencies are not increased, so that's down here, but up at the higher frequencies we do increase the loudness. So then they run that through a low-pass filter which pulls down the high frequencies, but since we pre-emphasize the music, it pulls down the noise to a low level, but pulls down the music to the desirable level. So that was what they were showing with the other curve here, which was the inverse of the first one. Here is the pre-emphasis. We increase the loudness of the high frequencies, and then the de-emphasis decreases the loudness of the high frequencies. So this makes the high frequencies louder and makes your record, if you listen to it without the equalization, sounds very tinny, but then we run it through the low-pass filter with the proper curve, and that brings everything back down to normal so that it sounds like normal. So that's what the RIAA equalization is for, is to reduce that noise. But another problem we have with vinyl records is the problem of dynamic range. So first let me draw a groove on a record, and I'm going to draw it the way I think they do it. So if I can draw a very thin line, that's the bottom of the groove. So we're looking at the V-shaped groove like this. So let's say that the sound is equal in both channels. In other words, we're recording a single sound that's halfway between the recording microphones. Therefore, it's affecting both walls of the groove equally, if I can hold my hands like the groove. And that means that it's also going to affect both speakers equally, and it's going to make the walls of the groove go like this. And that's effectively going to make the groove go up and down. And that might tend to throw the needle out of the groove, especially in loud passages. So what I think they do, although I haven't confirmed this, I believe that they flop one of the wires on one side, or just reverse the wires on one channel so that it's 90 degrees out of phase with the other. So now instead of the walls going like this, if they're equal in both channels, they're going to go like this. And so the needle will tend to go back and forth rather than up and down. So that's what I'm trying to show here. Now the problem is, here's a fairly loud passage here, and let's do a quiet passage where we don't have nearly as much movement of the groove. And I'll once again try to draw the line down the middle. And notice that a loud passage takes up more real estate than a quiet passage. And if you look at a record where there's both loud and soft music on the record, you'll see that the loud parts take up a lot more real estate, and they actually have to widen the distance between the grooves. I know it's actually one groove, but I will say grooves. They have to actually widen the distance between the grooves to accommodate the louder sounds. We can only be so quiet because we then can't overcome the noise of dragging the needle across the record. Even the equalization won't help. So we have to have a minimum amount of sound energy being recorded on the record. But then the maximum sound energy can only go so high because we're throwing that needle back and forth, and we could still throw the needle out of the groove if we have too wide of a movement of the groove. So what we have to do is use dynamic range compression. So the problem is the record cannot handle a wide dynamic range. The difference between the quietest practical part and the loudest possible part are not that far. So we have to make the quiet parts louder and the loud parts quieter, and that's called dynamic range compression. And that is what I think makes a record sound different. I really disagree with practical engineering saying that there's really no difference once you process everything. Because the vinyl has to have significant dynamic range compression, that does make it sound different. And it should be disturbing because it doesn't sound right, but I think that is what actually makes a vinyl record more pleasing to most people. I think it's actually the dynamic range compression that gives it the different sound that some people like. I can't say I don't like it myself. I like the sound of vinyl. The only thing I don't like about vinyl is that it's noisier with the clicks and pops and whatever. Every time you go over a speck of dust, you get a noise. But there is a definite difference in the sound between vinyl and a digital recording, and that's because of the dynamic range compression. Now there's another thing they didn't talk about in the video that I think is worth bringing up, because there are a couple of problems simply because this is recorded on a disc. If I draw a crude circle here, there's the center of it and there's the label. This is spinning at 33 1/3 RPM, and let's put the needle out here. There's our tone arm. And at the edge of the record, the angular velocity is the same because it's spinning at the same rotational speed, 33 1/3 RPM. But at any point in the record, the linear velocity changes, meaning the speed that the record is going under the needle is faster at the edge and slower in the middle. That means that we're packing the information more tightly in the middle because since it's going slower, we have to put everything closer together. So out on the edge, the groove might be doing this for a particular pitch. But in the middle, for the same pitch, because the surface is moving slower, that might look more like, well, terrible drawing, but you get the idea. So we have to have our curves in our groove that record the information closer together in the center of the record than we do at the edge. So that's one of the engineering problems that they have to take care of. And sometimes they really can't. I have some classical records that get kind of loud toward the middle of the record, and it really sounds distorted. Even new records with good equipment sounded significantly distorted because of the fact that it was not able to handle the high frequencies at the middle, at the loudness that it was working at, and because of the way the needle tracks, it was getting significant distortion. Another thing is, if we take this tone arm and get over to here, notice that this is probably exaggerated a lot, but not incredibly a lot. Notice how the pickup is canted to the groove over here. So we have the pickup needle, or the stylus. A good stylus was elliptical. So let's say over here, I'm going to split this apart to say this is toward the edge of the record. Otherwise, everything's the same. The needle is going to be aligned elliptically like that. The reason they make them elliptical is because then they can fit into smaller areas and pick up higher frequencies. But we get toward the middle and that ellipse is canted, and that causes phase distortion. When the record is recorded, they use a linear arm that moves like this, and so there's no phase distortion in the recording, but a typical turntable is going to give us phase distortion because of the twisting of the head. So that's another thing that has to be dealt with. Most turntables don't deal with it. What I would do if I were designing one, I would design the geometry to have my best geometry like right here, and so I would have less of a change from there to there and from there to there, but I'm not sure that's the way it's done. But one way the problem is solved is with a linear tracking turntable where the tone arm is on a lead screw, and as the record plays and the tone arm moves toward the center, it has sensors to notice that it's moving back and forth and averages it together and decides when to rotate the lead screw and slowly bring the tone arm in, and it stays perpendicular to the groove as it goes in. That's one solution. The other solution is one I used to have when I was into vinyl before the CD came out, and that was the Gerard 0100 turntable. Here's a picture of one here, and if you look closely, you'll see that the tone arm has two components. It has a second arm over here that produces a parallelogram with the main part of the tone arm. And so as that pivots along its arc, it causes the head to stay perpendicular. If I draw the rest of the arm, that mechanism causes that head to stay perpendicular to the groove even though the tone arm is moving across an arc. So the Real Engineering video said that microphones produce an analog or digital output, and that's not true. Microphones produce an analog output. If you want a digital output, you must have an analog to digital converter. Maybe a minor complaint, but that just clears things up. The second one was totally bogus. They showed the magnetic pickup where the counterweight is in a tone arm, and of course that all happens in the pickup cartridge, which is at the end of the tone arm. I thought I could say a little more about the equalization and the compression, and I added about the problems they have with the fact that it's recorded on a disc and the fact that the real estate available changes from the edge to the middle. Now, another thing to mention, just for what it's worth, I like the dynamic range compression of a vinyl disc. And that is because sometimes I like to listen to my music in a noisy environment, and I am a classical music listener. And classical music has very quiet parts and very loud parts. And so if I'm listening in a noisy environment, a quiet part comes on, I have to turn up the volume to hear it. And then when the loud part comes, it's rattling the windows and I have to turn it back down. Back in the days of vinyl, because of the dynamic range compression, I didn't have that problem. So nowadays, if I want to listen to music, I have to silence the room, take some time, maybe even clamp on some headphones, and just take the time to listen to the music because I cannot listen while I'm doing something else. Because of the wide dynamic range of digital recordings, it just doesn't work to listen in any kind of a noisy background whatsoever. The only reason I don't go back to vinyl is because I prefer the noise-free reproduction of digital. Because, of course, vinyl recordings have lots of pops and clicks and noises because of what it is. Instead of going back to vinyl, I'm seriously thinking of taking some of my recordings and running them through Audacity and compressing the dynamic range and maybe using those recordings in noisy environments if I want to listen then, and keep my original recordings for when I have time to just sit down and listen. So I hope I cleared up a few things, and I hope you found this useful and informative, and if you did, please give me a thumbs up down below. It really helps the channel. As always, a big thank you to my patrons and channel members and other donors. I could not make these videos without your support, and thanks to everyone for watching.